I need to begin with something of a disclaimer, because it would be easy for someone to conclude that this talk was going to have something to do with Manly P. Hall's book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, which it doesn't. Christopher Dixon, who's the chief of staff here, suggested I do a talk on the secret teachings of all ages. So I did, and am, as you will see. But it's not about Manly P. Hall's book. Manly P. Hall was an esotericist of the 20th century, whose most famous book is called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. It was published in 1927. And it's a large book. The original is large format. Now it's just a smaller format, much thicker book. And it's an impressive achievement, but on the other hand, there are enough little inaccuracies and not quite 100% things that are correct that should make one approach it with some caution. This is not to fault him, because he did remarkably well with the very limited amount of material there was in 1927. But this is not about him at all. It is about the secret teachings of all ages. So let's begin with secrecy. If these teachings are secret, why? Is somebody hiding them for the sake of some kind of hidden interest? Conspiracy theories are certainly very popular these days. They're so popular that I'm sure they're about to go out of fashion. And the idea is that there's somebody working behind the background to secretly control everything. This may or may not be true. I doubt it's true in any simple sense, just because people are constantly vying with each other, and the idea of having one single overarching conspiracy that runs everything runs just too counter to human nature, where people will go off on their own for their own particular interest pretty much at any time. And if you can imagine that if this is a completely sinister league of people whose motives are not good, the number one thing you have to assume about them, if they exist, is that they would be likely to turn on each other at pretty much any occasion, which would kind of defeat the purpose of this singular conspiracy. So it doesn't have to do with that. Secrecy, to some extent, has to do with the practical fact that most people are not interested in what we're going to be talking about tonight. The vast majority of people are just simply not interested, do not want to bother, don't understand what it is, and don't want to understand what it is. The vast majority of people are interested in their families, their jobs, their money, their homes, their sports teams, maybe political figures or political ideas sometimes. But the vast majority of people are not interested in the kind of things we're talking about. And I'm not talking about just the unwashed slobs out there. There are plenty of people I know, friends of mine, who have more advanced degrees than I have, who make any number of times more money than I do, who are, from an external point of view, far more accomplished and successful than I am, who are also not interested in these things. So it's not just a matter of intelligence. Social class, people of much higher social class, they're not in. People of the highest social class are, well, we won't go there. Anyway, so this in itself skews the balance in favor of secrecy, because there is no point in talking to people about things they don't want to hear. There's another issue, which is misunderstanding. It is very easy to misunderstand some, many, or all of these ideas if you don't want to understand them, if you're not willing to pay attention to them seriously. It doesn't help in our age that the mass media and the intelligentsia, I'm not talking about tabloid news. I'm talking about the most respected intellectual journals in this country, treat this subject with really frivolous contempt. And if they treated any other subject with such contempt for facts, authenticity, I mean, simple facts, they would, of course, be laughed out. But because this subject is so derided, they can make all sorts of fun about it and mock this stuff, mock some of these figures, like Blavatsky, for example, without even having read anything of theirs. I mean, if I want to say, for example, that Henry James is a bad writer or not as great a writer as people think he is, nobody's going to take me seriously if I haven't read Henry James. This is true about just about every intellectual discipline you can think of, except this one. So there's this point where secrecy simply comes of like keeping your mouth shut because it's just going to be misunderstood and made fun of. Now, this is a good situation. We're very lucky to be in this kind of situation. This situation is better than it's been in Western civilization for 2,000 years. Why? Because it's only being ignored and made fun of. It was dangerous to teach these ideas for a long, long time. It was against certain interests, notably that of the church and the churches, who would get down on you very, very fast if you started talking about this stuff in any way that didn't sound exactly like what they wanted you to say. And I do not believe that the churches would act very differently if they had the kind of power they had 500 years ago. But people 500 years ago, they decided they didn't like the way the churches were flaunting their power and abusing their power, so they took this power away from them. So now the churches are weak by standards of history and have to behave. I don't think it means that they're good. I mean, they're good individuals in it, but as institutions, they would be right back where they were 500 years ago if given the opportunity. In fact, the Western esoteric traditions, the Western version of all of this, was really in quite a bad way a couple of hundred years ago. It was in a bad way in that its practitioners had been scared so far underground that they no longer wanted to come out. And how did this manifest itself? All you have to do is read like some of the occult literature of the 19th century, and everything is regarded as a taboo. It's not lawful for me to speak about this. Only initiates can talk about this. And once you kind of go through it, you realize this is stuff that's obvious today. Some of it is even part of mass culture. But in those days, they were scared, and they were scared because they'd been under the gun for hundreds, if not a couple of thousand years. That's one of the things that Theosophy did, I think. Obviously, this is a Theosophical society, so I'm assuming you're familiar with it to one degree or another. But I think one reason the Theosophical society came loose, shall we say, or appeared in 1875 was that Western esotericism had gotten so holed up and no longer was even able to come out. In fact, they thought it was their duty not to tell anybody anything because, after all, they'd taken all these vows. And Theosophical Society, Madame Blavatsky, who, in her inimitable way, was something of a steamroller, just kind of blew her way through all of this. And it was an important service, even though, as usual, it wasn't recognized at the time. Now, this leads me to another question about Theosophy and the Theosophical Society. If you work here, especially if you were in the Theosophical Publishing House, which doesn't actively publish titles anymore, although it did, you would sometimes get these discussions and a bit of confusion about what people like to call big T Theosophy and little t Theosophy. Big T Theosophy is the doctrines of the Theosophical Society as presented by Blavatsky, Besant, Leadbeater, and their associates. It's a fairly comprehensive and fairly consistent esoteric system. It's not always easy to understand, but it's there. That is big T Theosophy. Well, what is little t Theosophy? Little t Theosophy is the secret teachings of all ages. Let's say these ideas are true. If they're true, because we're talking about the universe, God, beyond, if these things are true, they have to be universally true. And if they're universally true, it's very likely that people would have come to them independently, many different ways. And as a matter of fact, all of these secret teachings of all ages resemble one another far more than they differ. This is not to say that they're all saying the same thing, but they're saying a lot of the same things. And this points to their universality. Now, here's a question that will come up a lot of times. Why is this? Is this because of diffusion or because of archetypes? That is, diffusion means, and there are esoteric teachers who will say this, in prehistoric times there was an esoteric center where this primordial tradition lived. And as the population spread out throughout the world, this tradition kind of went with them. The archetypal theory means, well, the human mind is structured in this way, so these insights are going to kind of come to it because it's going to discover the same things about itself almost no matter where you are or who you are. I'm not going to take sides on this particularly. I think the diffusion idea is fascinating. It does definitely have a bit of the legendary to it. René Guénon was a famous esotericist who said it all came from Hyperborea. Hyperborea. Hyperborea, there was a place called Hyperborea, known to the ancient Greeks, although nobody knew exactly where it was, but except it means like way north. That's more or less what it means in Greek. And whether anybody had any contacts with it was unclear. But that's not what he was talking about. Sometimes the Irish like to call themselves Hyperboreans, and they're feeling grandiose because from the point of view of the Mediterranean world, Ireland was the far north. But according to Guénon, this civilization was a circumpolar civilization. That is to say, it was in the land around the North Pole. And it was the source of all these traditions. In those days, the area around the pole, according to this theory, was habitable. As I say, there's a lot of speculation here. But I think these things are worth considering. The other possibility is that human beings just found this stuff out all by themselves. It is remarkable. Probably the most universal tradition, most ancient and universal tradition is shamanism. And I have lectured on shamanism before, so I'm not going to do that tonight. But it is remarkably universal. And, you know, it wasn't like these aborigines had smartphones that they were communicating with people in the Andes or communicating with people in Africa. These people didn't know of each other's existence. Yet this shamanic tradition, whether it all started in the same place or whether people just realize that this is how the world worked, as I say, is an open question. So these things do go back. Now, to go back to the question of big T Theosophy versus little t Theosophy, what relation do the teachings of the Theosophical Society have to the secret teachings of all ages? Well, the only, I think, authentic answer to that is that they are, in my view, a legitimate, but not the only legitimate picture of the secret teachings of all ages. And this is because of, let me use a trendy word here, enculturation. All of these traditions are enculturated. What does that mean? Well, it's going to take this form in this particular society, civilization, culture. It's going to be expressed in a language. I mean, it has to be expressed in some language, right? It's going to take certain symbolic forms. So there's no pure teaching that can be abstracted from this that isn't in some way enculturated. What do I mean? Well, let's say you're not feeling well and you want the services of medicine. Medicine is a discipline. Well, you could go to a Western doctor, you could go to an Ayurvedic doctor, you could go to an acupuncturist, you could go to all sorts of different medical modalities. But let's say you don't want any of that. I don't want Western medicine. I don't want Ayurveda. I don't want acupuncture. I don't want Chinese medicine. I just want pure medicine. It's quite obvious right there that you're never going to get it because medicine is enculturated. What was medicine, medical practice, we like to think is better now than it was in 1700, but it's enculturated just in the same way. There's no abstract teaching of medicine that you can really pull out from some kind of cultural expression. So all of them are going to be this way. Now here's a little problem because everything, as you all know, changes ceaselessly. And that includes language. And language, words mutate endlessly. In 19th century France, a Republican was a liberal. In Ireland today, a Republican with a capital R is a radical because these are the people in the North who want to unite with the South. They were the people who were blowing up subway tubes in London years ago. These were Republicans, as in Irish Republicans. So there it means radical. So just that one word changes meaning. And words in general do change meanings. So that all has to be accounted for. And you have to have, shall we say, the knowledge to be able to update it and adapt it, not only in terms of language as such, but in terms of concepts for the time that you're dealing with. And it's got to be a creative process. And it's got to be a creative process because if you're not working with it actively, if your mind is not working with it, if your, shall we say, whole being is not working with it, you're wasting your time anyway. So part of this enculturation is in its practitioners. Like, what do we make of this today? What do we make of this tradition today? They're, shall we say, Kabbalists. What a Kabbalist was in 13th century Spain, the Kabbalah is the esoteric teaching of Judaism. That is the enculturated form of the secret teachings of all ages in Judaism, although it's practiced and taught widely outside of Judaism. But what the Kabbalah was in 13th century Spain and what it is now are two quite different things. And guess what? Those texts from 13th century Spain are just about incomprehensible. And I don't think the scholars understand them too well. But that's not my problem, that is theirs. I've cooked up a Latin motto for my family, which they have adopted somewhat equivocally. Non mea cura, not my problem. If you think about the vast majority of things in the world, they're just simply not your problem. You can't do anything about it. I mean, you might find it fun to start ranting on about the Mueller report, but it's very likely, unless you were very, very different from the Wheaton audience I know and love, you're not going to do anything about this. You can't. That leads to another subject, is why we get upset about things that we can't control. But hey, that's another talk. So, but anyway, to go back to that. So these are the secret teachings. And because they're universal, they are of all ages. So what are these secret teachings? You'll see some very common features if you look at a lot of them, and you'll usually, I'm not going to write anything up, but a lot of it is you see a lot of charts. A lot of charts and a lot of diagrams. And a lot of these are different levels. This is possibly alluded to in the book of Genesis, where Jacob sees the angels on the ladder ascending and descending. But you have all these different tiers of reality, supposedly. And you don't have to look very hard at these teachings and these diagrams to realize they're very hard to figure out. Generally, and I'm talking as much about my experience as anyone else's, well, the first kind of couple down here are kind of easy to understand, sort of, like the physical body. Well, we all sort of know what that is. And then it gets more and more rarefied, and all sorts of obscure terms in Sanskrit or Hebrew or whatever language you like start to come up. And you realize, well, I guess I'm going to either take this on faith, or I'm just going to decide it's nonsense and go back to preoccupying myself with the fate of the Chicago Cubs. It's not to say these diagrams are wrong. In fact, they too resemble each other extraordinarily. But they don't necessarily kind of tell you where they're coming from or the real perspective that they're coming from. And even this is a secret teaching. None of this viewed as a ladder out there is beyond a certain minimal point terribly helpful in understanding the concept. You have to start with, let me call it the cognizing subject. That in you which says I. Well, this is also in the secret teachings of all ages. There are all sorts of names for it in all sorts of tradition. The Buddhists don't believe in it, but that's another thing. John will explain sometime why the Buddhists don't believe in it. But here, we'll just take it as kind of a general thing. This kind of part in you that is kind of this cognizing subject, and everything else out there. So this cognizing subject is in the Hindu tradition, it's called the Atman, and the Buddhist doctrine is Anatman, which means, no, there's no Atman. But I'm straying. So there's this cognizing subject, this kind of internal witness, this I am presence. I remember once making a talk to these people in a, basically it was a facility for the people who are suffering from muscular dystrophy. And I made this point, and most of these people could barely move. But when I said that, they were all kind of nodding, because it's true. There is something in you that says I. And then there's something out there, the world, right? Now, this relationship between I and the world needs to be investigated a little more scrupulously than it usually is. But let's begin with the simplest, which is always going to be at the lowest level, at least as far as we experience it, which is the physical world. And the physical world, in this sense, is not quite exactly what I'm talking about with the laws of physics or biology or whatever. This is the world as we experience it. And these are sometimes called the five senses. Here's another secret teaching. Usually when you see the symbolism of the number 5, it has something to do with man or humanity at a natural level. What does the pentagram mean? This is what the pentagram means. I mean, you can get incredibly superstitious about it, and God knows people do, but that's its symbolic meaning. You have 5 points, just like the star. You have 5 senses. There are lots of esoteric allusions to it. Like, for example, the 5 wounds of Christ. There's a verse in the book of Jeremiah that says, death cometh in at our doors. Well, these are our doors. That is to say, if we experience misfortune, it's going to be through one of these 5 doors. And that is this world. Of course, there are 5 elements. I mean, classically. And these are, of course, states of matter, not elements in the sense of the periodic table. But the earth is what's solid, water is what's fluid, air is present, but somehow not entirely immediately perceptible unless for some reason you're not getting any. And fire is, this agent of transformation. And then there's sometimes said to be this 5th element called the quintessence, which is sort of behind all of these. To say that this is scientifically true is not necessarily the case, but just from what I've said, you can see that this concept of the 4 elements is a lot easier to relate to. It helps us sort out our experience and understand it a lot more concretely than learning the periodic tables, which have their use, but they're not really very directly accessible to us. So this is the world of the senses. Now, there are certain problems with this world, this world of the senses. One of which is that it's very overwhelming. You generally feel submerged in it most of the time, and you feel like you're carried along in it. Things are happening, especially in America. America today, everything is it's just this constant speed of things happening. And this is, to some extent, artificially generated, not only by the media, but, I mean, if you look at pop songs, have you ever listened to pop songs? Because you're going to hear them whether you like it or not if you go to, like, the grocery supermarket or whatever. And they all tend to be kind of these bouncy, kind of, up kind of music. I mean, they're not playing Beethoven's string quartets at Mariano's. I don't know, maybe they are. Probably stop very soon. We're carried along in this pace, and this is the particular pace of our culture. If we were Russian peasants 500 years ago, the pace would be the pace of the seasons and the crop cycles and so on. It would be a slower thing, but we'd still be caught up in it. And it's very hard not to feel at the mercy of it. So that is kind of that one level. Now the second level, this is a continuum, right? It's like the color spectrum. It's a continuum. You can break it down in bandwidths, but in a way that's quite subjective. Speaking of different languages have many different amounts of color words. Some languages have very few or none. Well, very few anyway. We have a lot. That means that we, or at least somebody, can tell the difference between teal and turquoise and aqua. I mean, especially, I guess, if you're a fashion designer or something. But we can perceive that. Similarly, all of these realms that I'm talking about, you can break them down in lots of different ways, depending on the refinement of your observation. So let's go to the next one. All right, well, sensation is in a way fairly obvious, we think. I feel when I'm hungry, I feel when I'm sexually aroused, I feel when I'm tired. But if a certain amount of introspective consciousness is brought to this sensation, it starts to feel kind of different. And I'm talking like meditative practice and various types of esoteric practice. You may or may not have a sense of this without any practice. You start to feel your bodily sensations more as currents of energy. Most people do this to some degree or another, but you're experiencing these currents of energy. And guess what? If you can do that, and you do it long enough, and you use a very refined observation on it, you can almost map these things out. Hence, the Chinese maps of the meridians and so on. No Chinese doctor is going to say, you cut somebody open, you'll find the meridians. Nobody would pretend that. That's not what it is. But it is kind of this next level of the physical, which you can experience as current life energy, that kind of thing. In terms of the Theosophical language, it's sometimes called the Etheric, which is connected with prana, which is the life force. Again, you can, with a certain amount of experience, you can feel life force circulating in you. You can even make it go places where, if you want to, you can kind of do that. And that's what a lot of Tai Chi type practices are about. So that's the etheric level. And obviously with all these levels, as you've already seen just from the little bit I've said, all of these levels have, you can work with them to remarkably subtle and powerful degrees. Doing something like becoming a Tai Chi master would require working with what I've just been talking about, and your capacities with it would become very, very refined and powerful. Just the way if you work on the physical body in the way of a conventional athlete, the physical body will become very powerful and adept at whatever it is it's supposed to do. So that's level 2. The next level is if you close your eyes, you will, unless you fall asleep almost immediately, you're going to see this series of thoughts passing across the screen of your mind. They may not all be visual. They may be sounds. They may be ideas. There may be like, oh my God, I have to get up so early tomorrow. This stream of consciousness, as it's been called, is almost impossible to stop. If you try to stop your thoughts, well, go ahead, try it. So you could try it now. You're probably not going to make it for more than a second or two. Nor would I. But it has an emotional component as well. It has to do with feelings. And you could call it the astral level. Now, if you look at the Theosophical literature, for example, the extremely influential books by Leadbeater and Besant in the early 20th century, you'll see pictures of auras, colors. And there are people, not many, but there are people who can experience these astral forms with a certain kind of sight, or by switching their sight in a certain way. That is very rare, by the way. Most people do not perceive this astral level visually, and probably would only be able to do so after a large amount of training. I mean, I know one woman who does. I'm not going to mention her name, but she was raised this way. She had this capacity when she was a child. She came in a Theosophical family, so fortunately they didn't think she was crazy. So, she had this capacity and was able to develop it. Just the way if you have musical talent and your parents are not totally unsympathetic, you could be a, very skilled pianist. But we don't experience things that way. I mean, I've seen maybe some kind of flashes of this, but not very many. But we do experience the astral realm kinesthetically, as in, this place gives me the creeps. You're not seeing, only in, bad horror movies is there, these like, shadowy figures lurking in the corner. But those images are attempts of reproducing the way people feel about certain places or certain other people. I mean, every horror movie has the same beginning. Gee, that old house on the hill really gives me the creeps. Yeah, me too. Let's go in. Most of those movies are, the person does the least logical, the least sensible thing all the time. There's this blood dripping out from the ceiling. Let me go through that door. Let's see what it's like back there. But anyway, those are attempts to portray what we're experiencing kinesthetically. There are people I've known who you sit down and talk to them and you're just drowsy. And the minute they go on, it's like, oh, I feel all right again. There are people who are just energy suckers, and I think most of them are not really aware of it. There are other people that feels good to be around them. Whenever I feel around this person, I'm motivated, and that's what leaders have to have that to some degree. I mean, you're not going to get very far as a leader, certainly of any size, without being able to electrify people. And the more you can electrify people, the more you'll get. So people are always reading this kind of stuff off each other. And the energy is exchanged. I mean, sometimes it could be too much. You do get a sense, like certain celebrities like rock stars get so much of this energy thrown at them by their audiences that either they can't deal with it, so they end up like, going out on drugs just to kind of numb themselves to it, or they become addicted to it and take another set of drugs to try and maybe feel that way when they're not having all this adulation thrown at them. None of this, of course, is recognized to science, but it is, again, universally known. And it's always helpful, I think, when you come across these esoteric ideas, at least think about what in your experience they might correspond to. Let's talk about another esoteric idea known as Kundalini. We're all, I think, fairly knowledgeable people. You know what the Kundalini fire is supposed to be. There's this fire at the base of your spine that you can send up the base of your spine to your higher chakras and out. The most famous description of the Kundalini awakening experience is a book called Kundalini by one Gopi Krishna. It's still in print and it's been widely read. I cannot for the life of me, after reading that book, understand why anyone who'd read it would actually want to have this experience because, well, I had 9 months of excruciating, splitting headaches that were unbearable, did not permit me to sleep or do anything. Okay, I guess this may be worth it. So most of us are not going to have that. It's probably not a good idea to do so unless you have some really specialized reason. And by the way, you're getting some training by somebody who knows what he or she is doing. But I think everybody has a Kundalini awakening. I think all of you have had small Kundalini awakenings, also known as chills going up your spine. Now, chills go up your spine generally for two reasons. One is fear. Something scares you, as in a horror movie. Or you see some remarkably beautiful picture or artwork or vista. In both cases, here's what I suggest is happening. There is obviously some sort of vital energy center located down there. This whole area is classically considered kind of where your vital energy sits, right? When you need a certain hit of emotional energy, the body automatically sends some of this up the spine. It's a chill up the spine. You feel this, it is a slightly electrical feeling. And again, this vital center is sending up some energy, usually to the emotional center. And it does this naturally. Obviously, no one, although every last thing in this world at this point has been touted as being dangerous, no one yet has managed to say that having chills go up your spine is dangerous. I don't want to put any ideas out there. But it's harmless, and it's a natural thing. But you could say it is a mild, light Kundalini awakening. And that might give us a hint about what all of these arcane processes are about. And what can you do a lot more with it? Yeah, I think you can. It might be better to reflect why you do it. So anyway, you have these levels, this physical level, you have this energetic level, and you start to have this level of the emotions. And then it goes to the level of the mind, where you have mental images, abstract thought. Now this gets interesting. You've all seen sacred geometry. Examples of it. That is an example of it, I think. Because you'll notice how stylized all of these are. They all resemble each other in terms of proportions. Point here goes to the point here. You can almost see them. Once, it was in a San Francisco gallery, I saw a piece of paper that was the kind of grid used to draw these. It wasn't very expensive. I really should have bought it. So why is that? Why is this grid pattern so appealing to us? Well, let me suggest that all of this sacred geometry has to do with the fact that we cognize the world in these kind of geometric terms. Whether the world is really that way or not is like a big question, but we do experience the world this way. Our world, for example, why are the circle and the square such universal symbols? Well, it's easy if you think about it, because look. It's a circle. Square. Front, back, left, right. So these are the coordinates of our reality. So the circle and they have various symbolic connotations, but you can see why they're so fundamental, because we're actually made that way. Like the Indians, the American Indians will make offerings to the 6 directions. Well, what is that? It's just this with up and down added. Again, that's this square business is 3-dimensional and, 2-dimensional, and adding that axis makes it 3-dimensional. We live in a structure of 3-dimensional reality. That's why our cognition is based on that. And let's say you want to get some kind of experience of that. Of course, one always has to preface this with all sorts of disclaimers and caveats and so on. But if people who take psychedelic drugs will often see geometric patterns in everything. What does this mean? It could mean that kind of the overlay of reality is stripped away a little bit, and you're seeing a little bit of the, shall we say, the structure underneath. Again, it's a big question to say whether this structure is really there or it's just the way we perceive it. For example, this back, would an octopus see the world this way? Probably not. What kind of esoteric teachings would octopuses have? I don't know. But they might not, they might have very different coordinates from ours. I don't know, someday we may be able to talk them and they'll be able to tell us. So this is, in a sense, kind of the highest level that we can experience. It's very abstract, it's very geometric. As I think some of you know, Plato founded his academy, and he wrote above it, "No one here can come in who does not know geometry." Why? Maybe because, especially in those days, they were really starting to understand that geometric principles underlay it. Everything that as we experience it. Well, now, so all of this is in relation to self and other. All of these things are, hey, I'm cognizing this. Whether it's a sacred image, whether it's garbage in the subway or whatever. There's even your own feelings. You can cognize them and experience them as others. And that's partly what many types of meditation are bound to do. All of that is self and other. But hey, what if the Buddhists are right? Maybe this is all kind of not entirely 100% correct. Notice, here's another secret teaching worldwide, which is illusion. Or the Sanskrit term is avidya, which is usually translated ignorance, but I think obliviousness may be a better term. There's some kind of primal not seeing that is happening here. And again, there's many traditions. Avidya is one. The cloud of unknowing is a Christian one. So it is possible that this dynamic of self and other, that's the underlying structure of everything that we've just dealt with, may be the result of, shall we say, a cosmic mistake, a cosmic lapse of attention, a cosmic blackout. What is the Tibetan? Ma Rigpa, no consciousness. Of course, in Miracles talks about it as the circle of fear, because its teaching is that this is all a primordial fear of God. Hey, let's see what it'd be like to live without God. Whoops, he must be really mad at me for thinking that so. And this is such a shock that you go into this blank space. And here's another funny thing you notice. When you talk about, you'll hear peculiar things such as, Hindu yogis will say this, the closest mental state to enlightenment is deep sleep. Well, it's reassuring in a way, since we all spend some time in it. But it may mean that all of this is, the world of avidya, the world of samsara, and then there's this blackout and there's something beyond. Nirvana, enlightenment, God. That's pretty scary because it means we have no idea what's going on. We have no idea what's going on. Some of you may remember Senator Gary Hart, who ran for president in 1988. He wrote posted something on it, a book called The Education of Henry Adams. And I had read it and I said, I get the impression from this book that even the people at the top really don't know what's going on. Gary Hart wrote back and said, "Mr. Smoley, you were right." And that's probably true. They may know, well, a different set of things than we do. But this whole constant, there's this constant that maybe we're not really seeing the whole picture. We're not really seeing it accurately. This is also quite a universal teaching. And I think one has to take it seriously. Of course, you can immediately become paranoid and decide, what am I going to do? And people do. I really think people get a glimpse of this kind of chasm, and it blows their minds. Which is one thing like, well, maybe you shouldn't push too hard in that direction. Maybe you shouldn't eat, 750 micrograms of acid or something of the sort. But this again has, these are all very universal and very powerful themes that constantly keep resurfacing. I'm giving you a very short and concise view of these themes, but I do believe they are present in the secret teachings of just about all ages in different forms, different names. Lots of subcategories. There are lots of little ramifications that you don't want me to go into because lecture time is just about over. But I think this is at least some of the central themes of these secret teachings. And here's another reason. If I'm right about this avidya that kind of underlies all of relative existence or relative experience, it probably isn't a bad idea to keep this idea from majority of people, because it'll either freak out or guess what, or it becomes a license for anything, which is still worse. So all of this stuff, you can see how it would require a certain amount of discretion.
Thank you, Richard. Fascinating as always. I read a book a couple of years ago called The Secret Life of Kids, which children apparently are much more adept at seeing auras than adults are up to a certain age. And I think I experienced it last year. I spent a lot of time on the West Coast, and I spent a fair amount of time with some neighbors' kids, and two out of the three of them, I would see them quite often kind of squinting up at me. and I didn't ask them about it because I don't, as far as I know, their parents are completely unacquainted with any of this stuff. Mm-hmm. But I definitely had the impression that two of these, the little girl was 5 and her brother was 7, that they were looking at my aura. But I just didn't, I don't know. I didn't know how to approach it, so I didn't. But I wonder if you, have read anything or experienced anything about kids being more sensitive to that than the average adult.
Well, I think they're definitely more sensitive. I would say, just from my limited experience, like having 2 children, they're, again, more likely to experience that sort of thing kinesthetically. That's not to say they can't see auras or won't. And you're probably right that they're more likely to see them than adults are. And if for no other reason than by adult life, they've gotten so much conditioning that says this sort of thing is nonsense that, we're conditioned all the time. We're Charles Tart, famous parapsychologist, called us consensus trance. We're just under hypnotic suggestion all the time. In fact, he said that the most powerful and most sinister hypnotic trance is that imposed by parents upon their children. Because let's say you go to a hypnotist to quit smoking or something like that. He puts you under and, half hour later you come out and maybe you quit smoking or maybe you don't. But this hypnotist has no kind of power or authority over you to any degree that your parents have when you're tiny and helpless. The way they're telling you is the way that it is. The way they're telling you is the way your brain is going to structure the way you think it is, which may explain why in so many cultures people see spirits a lot more than we do. Because here it's just like I don't want to hear about it. So I think there's definite truth into it, in that. I mean, my younger son is 9, and he was taking a bath last night, and he wanted someone to come upstairs with him because he didn't want to be alone on the 2nd floor. Our house is not particularly sinister, I don't think. And I felt that way too. I was really afraid to be alone on the 2nd floor when I was that age. I was wondering, what was he picking up on? What was I picking up on? I mean, I have my own theories about myself, but you know, they do kind of feel things, and sometimes I think see things that we're less likely to see.
Well, thanks. Very, very interesting, everything you said. But you mentioned 2 basic patterns: diffusion or archetypes. No? Okay. But it seems I had the impression that you took a 3rd way, which I will call, let's say, a phenomenological way, based on actual experiences that every human being can have universally. Mm-hmm. I was remembering a beautiful book by Rudolf Steiner called Theosophy, because he was at the Theosophical Society at that time when he wrote this book, and he shares the basic Theosophical cosmology, but all the time based on actual experiences that human beings can have. Mm-hmm. But well, my first question is, how do you relate this phenomenological approach to the 2 options you gave before? Okay, this is one question. And another thing I want to say very quickly is based on what you said. I live in Brazil. I am Brazilian, and in the 90s especially, I had a lot of experience working in the Amazon forest. And with the people living in the forest, mostly illiterated people, first they have this, I am not nostalgic and telling about the Bon Sauvage or things like that, but first they had this feeling of the cosmos, of nature, because you can feel the sky almost falling down near you. But what impressed me is that they talk about what we call nature spirits or visions of, we can use our language, etheric field, or they talk in a very natural way. You know? It's like a day-by-day experience. They are all the time talking about, I saw something, I got someone sent me a thought, you know. I got a thought from someone living on the other side of the region. And I was thinking, you were talking about children, but I was thinking that in this world we live, in this urban industrial world, the actual experiences, there are some limitations. Now we cannot feel the sky. We cannot anymore. We almost don't see the sky. But it was, and of course there are people more sensitive and even clairvoyants. But I was impressed at how normal people living deep in the forest, they had this feeling all the time. But this is just a comment. My question was about the patterns you put before.
Well, in one sense, a lot of what I'm saying is phenomenological, because I was kind of going from the cognizing subject. This is how we experience the world. In fact, one of the things I did not talk about at all tonight is how the world really is, or what it might be like apart from our phenomenological experience of it. So in a sense, that's true. So I think my approach is somewhat phenomenological. As for Steiner, he had a lot of these really quite powerful visions. I'll throw something out about Steiner. If you look at, it's translated variously, How to Know Higher Worlds, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. I think it's actually in the outline of occult science, he sort of goes back and kind of reads the Akashic records and talks about like what phases of reality called Old Moon and, Old Jupiter. I don't know the system particularly well. And you come across things like, well, these beings, their primary experience of the world was through as of heat. And maybe one thing he was picking up on, let's say the Akashic records are, shall we say, the records of everything that has been experienced by anybody. Well, if you really are going back to those times when all of life is cold-blooded, heat suddenly becomes a lot more important as a coordinate. I mean, it's probably still true for, the litter in your yard. But yeah, that's how they would experience the world, through heat. Maybe he was somehow picking up on how the dinosaurs, for example, cognized the world. Not what they looked like, but how they saw and experienced. A dinosaur would not see a dinosaur in the way we would see it, right? Because their eyes were different. Their eyes were different. As you know, bees see colors. We can't. Dogs hear sounds. We can't. Can smell things. We can't. What we think of as a world is very much limited by these senses, at least as we experience them. Now, what you say, I think, is very important because we limit it far too much, particularly these days. So if you live in a culture where this has always been accepted, and even in the West, it was accepted until maybe 400 years ago. It's there, and who knows what we would perceive. But a lot of reasons we're not perceiving is, one, we're told we can't, and two, we're scared of it. Because our view of this whole occult world is pretty much a Hollywood view. And I don't think Hollywood created it. I think Hollywood reflected people's real fears and apprehensions about the occult world. Otherwise, no one would be going. We may be in much more of a cognitive trap than these people are in. It's not the most pleasant thing to say, but or the most reassuring thing to say, but I think we have to consider it at least as a possibility.
First of all, thanks, Richard, for speaking. So I don't know if I really have too much of a question, but just kind of a comment too. But I feel I've been reading a bit about like esoteric things, and like I've been reading Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings, and I can't help but feel a little disheartened by reading them, because although they're very, very fascinating and I'm endlessly interested by all this stuff, I feel that in reading, I'm not getting very much closer to the truth. And I don't know if I'm explaining this well enough, but like for me, the truth is singular, and through reading books, you can't really exactly get at it, I think the truth comes in experiences. And it can only be beheld instead of understood. So I was just wondering, is there any like surefire way to make it that the truth gets revealed to you? And I think that's all I had to say.
Well, I'll give you the short answer. It's my own personal belief. If you are inwardly sincere about wanting to know this, you will have as much given to you as you can take at that time, if you're inwardly sincere. And nobody's completely inwardly sincere. We all have our little phonynesses. And the people we're most often phony of is, unfortunately, ourselves. But that in itself is an insight. And part of the thing is when I realize, wow, to what extent am I kidding myself? To what extent, maybe I think I'm something totally different than the way the world sees me. It's not that the world is right, but it's probably something you need to take into account. So it is going to be a process. I think, with an element of inner sincerity, you will get it. I'm going to tell you a little bit. The thing about Manly P. Hall's books is a point I raised earlier. All right, he wrote that book 90 years ago, and the language and the thought has changed a lot. And I noticed myself, even books written 50 years ago when I was a kid, are starting to seem a little archaic in tone because the language has changed a lot in 50 years. And so if you go back to Manly P. Hall or Blavatsky, they were writing in an idiom that was more or less accepted. They wrote in a much more flowery way than we like these days. They wrote in a much more elaborate way. They wrote much more complex sentences. This can be beautiful if it's done right. It can be really kind of awful if it isn't. But we're not as used to that. And that in itself takes some getting through. So I guess, I don't know, I should take a look at a couple of my books. I mean, I've made every effort, in like Hidden Wisdom and Inner Christianity to say this stuff as plainly and clearly as I can. And I think I've said the stuff more plainly and more clearly than most, which may not even be much of a self-compliment, but, So that's one thing. But I think the basic point is that, the other obvious thing is, if you're not kind of getting much juice out of it, well, then just set it aside for a while and find something else. You don't need to throw the book away. It may mean that 10 years later you'll go back to it and understand. I certainly had books that I read. Wow, 20 years ago, I really just didn't understand this book. I just wasn't ready for it. So that's a thing to keep in mind too. I would say there's more hope than you may be feeling right now, in short.